Chemically, hormones can be divided into two separate classifications: lipid-soluble or water-soluble. This also is useful because they function differently based on their chemical makeup and, of course, the effect that they're going to exert on the tissues that they bind to is going to act differently based on their solubility. Lipid-soluble hormones include the steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, and nitric oxide. So steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol. Thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, are made when we attach iodines to amino acids, and nitric oxide is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. The water-soluble hormones include amine hormones and peptides and proteins and eicosanoids, but you hear what they all have in common there, right? There's something about a protein, amine, peptide, protein. So several of the protein hormones, such as thyroid-stimulating hormone, might also have a sugar group attached to it or a carbohydrate group, so we call those glycoproteins. The eicosanoids we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit, but there are two major classes of eicosanoids, and those are prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And the eicosanoids are also local hormones. Remember, we call those paracrines. So we'll look at each one of those as well. Okay, so most water-soluble, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. All right, sorry about that. I jumped to the next slide before I was ready to. So most of the water-soluble hormones are just going to circulate in the watery blood plasma in the form of a free or not attached hormone, so it's not bound to any other molecule. But the lipid-soluble hormone molecules travel bound to transport proteins, and these transport proteins are going to move these hormones throughout the bloodstream and help to make them sort of temporarily water-soluble because of the lipid component of this. Something that I think is really interesting about the lipid versus non-lipid hormones, both steroid hormones and thyroid hormones, now remember these are lipid-soluble, they're both effective if you have to take hormones. You can take them by mouth and they're effective because they're not split apart or broken down during digestion. So they easily cross the intestinal lining, again, because they're lipid-soluble. But protein hormones, peptide and protein hormones like insulin, are not effective when taking as oral medications because the digestive enzymes destroy those proteins by breaking down those peptide bonds. That's why people that have to take insulin have to take it with injections for it to be effective so that it gets into the blood and can travel out to those target cells. Okay, now we can move forward. So the response that a hormone is going to have on a cell depends on the hormone itself, but also the cell. So target cells respond differently to the same hormone in different parts of the body. For example, insulin stimulates the synthesis of glycogen in the liver and the synthesis of triglycerides in fat tissue. Other effects of hormones include that they may change the permeability of cell membranes so that some things that could or could not pass the membrane now will. They also stimulate the transport of substances into or out of the cell, such as when insulin binds a cell, it causes glucose transporters to be embedded in the cell membrane so that glucose can now get into those target cells. Other hormones can alter the rate of metabolic reactions by speeding things up or slowing things down within the cell. Sometimes the hormones can cause contraction of smooth or cardiac muscle cells. So the action, again, is going to depend on the type of receptor and the type of tissue where those receptors are located. All right, so we have those two major classifications, remember, of the lipid-soluble versus non-lipid-soluble. So lipid-soluble hormones, which include the steroid hormones and thyroid hormones, are going to bind to receptors inside the cell. Now remember, these are lipid-based hormones. Your cell membranes are made of lipids. So what happens when lipid meets lipid? they just sort of merge together and form a big lipid, right? I often use the example of if you cook spaghetti and you put your water in a pot and you decide you want to pour some oil in there so that your noodles don't stick together when they're cooking, right? So before your water starts boiling, you've got a pot of water and you pour oil into there and you look at it and you've got hundreds of teeny tiny little oil drops. But if you stand there and you watch for a few minutes, all those oil drops will start merging together to form one great big oil drop. Remember, oil is a lipid. So that's the way that, similar to what happens with these lipid-based hormones. So when lipid meets lipid, they just sort of become one big lipid, and then of course those chemical molecules can diffuse into the cell across the membrane. So a free lipid-soluble hormone molecule will diffuse from the blood into the interstitial fluid and then through that phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. If the cell is a target cell, then inside the cell there are receptors. So the hormone's going to bind to and activate that receptor in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus of the cell. The activated hormone receptor complex then is going to alter gene expression. So it either turns genes on or turns genes off. If it's turning genes on, DNA is being transcribed, new messenger RNA is being made. The messenger RNA will then leave the nucleus, enter the cytoplasm of the cell, and find a ribosome where protein synthesis begins. And once protein synthesis begins, we're making a new protein. That new protein can alter the cell's activity and then cause a response within that particular cell. An example of this is the hormone aldosterone that's released from the adrenal glands. So if your blood pressure gets low, then one easy way to get that blood pressure back to normal is to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone causes us to retain sodium and causes us to retain water because of that sodium. So if aldosterone is released into the blood from the adrenal glands, it travels through the blood out to target cells, and these targets happen to be in the kidneys. So in the kidneys, aldosterone will diffuse across the membrane. Remember, it's lipid soluble. So it's going to diffuse across the membrane into those kidney cells. Once it's inside a kidney cell, it's going to bind to a receptor and form a complex. That hormone receptor complex then binds a particular gene, and that gene holds the instructions for making sodium-potassium pumps. So we make the strand of RNA, messenger RNA, and take it out to a ribosome and start hooking together amino acids to make a protein. That protein then is going to be modified and a new sodium-potassium pump is created. Then that protein is going to alter the cell's activity. So what's it going to do? It's going to be inserted into the walls of those little filtration units in the within the kidney, and it pumps sodium out of the filtration unit, which means that sodium gets resorbed back into the bloodstream. And as we know, anywhere sodium goes, water goes. So as that water gets resorbed back into the bloodstream, then blood pressure goes up. So all this started, why? Because the stimulus was low blood pressure. We secreted aldosterone. It diffuses across the membrane, binds a receptor, turns on a gene, and sodium-potassium pumps are made. The non-steroid hormones, or the water-soluble hormones, remember, are made primarily of proteins, so they're not lipid-soluble. They can't diffuse across that phospholipid bilayer, so they have to bind receptors on the outside of the cell. So these hormones bind to integral proteins. Remember, these are the ones that run all the way through the protein, or all the way through the cell membrane. And when they do so, they're called the first messenger. Okay, so here we've got our hormone. It diffuses across the wall of the capillary into the interstitial space and binds a receptor on the outside of the cell. So this is an integral protein that extends all the way from the extracellular to the intracellular environment. Now, when that hormone, that water-soluble protein-based hormone, binds that receptor, it's called the first messenger. it then causes the production of what we call a second messenger inside a cell. Now, here's where things start to get a little complicated. Binding activates a second messenger that turns on an enzymatic pathway. Now, that enzymatic pathway is going to differ depending on what the cell is and what the hormone is. So I often say, don't get bogged down in the specifics of all of this enzymatic pathway, right? Because it's going to change depending on what the cell is and what the hormone is. So the idea to understand here, let's say our hormone is insulin. Insulin binds an extracellular receptor. It's the first messenger. It activates a second messenger, which then starts an enzymatic cascade. Now, remember what insulin does. Insulin is released when blood sugar levels are high. So what do we want to do? We want to get sugar inside the cell. So the enzymatic pathway that's turned on when insulin binds is to have glucose pumps be installed in the membrane of the cell. So blood sugar can then get inside because we've gotten those little transporters embedded in the membrane. So what happened? Let's go back through this. Insulin was released because blood sugar levels were high. The insulin diffused out of the bloodstream and bound to a receptor on the extracellular surface of the cell. It turned on an enzymatic pathway that resulted in glucose transporters being embedded in the cell membrane. Then the glucose could be brought into the cell. This is also how growth hormone, another protein-based hormone, works. It binds an extracellular receptor and turns on the machinery that causes mitosis to occur. So more and more and more cells are created, hence the name growth hormone. How a target cell responds to a hormone is based on three things primarily: how much of the hormone is in the blood, how many receptors are on the target cell, and if there are other hormones around to exert an influence. So there are some hormones that have to have another hormone around to basically give permission. So we call that a permissive effect. So the actions of hormones on target cells require a simultaneous or recent exposure to a second hormone. So an example of that is epinephrine. So by itself, it has a very weak stimulating effect on the breakdown of certain lipids. But when small amounts of thyroid hormone are present, the same exact amount of epinephrine causes a whole lot more of those lipids to be broken down. So that's a permissive hormone. Sometimes these permissive hormones can increase the number of receptors for other hormones as well. When two hormones act together and their effect is greater than either one of them by themselves, that is said to be synergistic. For instance, glucagon and epinephrine both increase blood sugar, but together they increase it much more. I often use the example of if I'm trying to pick up a heavy table in lab by myself, I might move it a little bit. But if I call someone up to help me, our synergistic effect is going to be much more effective. So many hormones have synergistic effects. But often one hormone is going to work in the opposite direction of another, and this is when those hormones have antagonistic effects. So an example of this are the hormones insulin and glucagon. So insulin promotes the breakdown of glycogen, promotes glycogen to be created by liver cells. So the liver is going to take blood sugar and build glycogen and put it into the liver to store it for when we need it. So when blood sugar levels drop, glucagon causes that glycogen to be broken down in the liver. So one causes blood sugar levels to go up, one causes blood sugar levels to go down. You'll see also that there are two hormones that do the same thing with calcium. Calcitonin lowers your blood calcium by causing more bone to be made. Parathyroid hormone increases your blood calcium by causing bone to be broken down, so we release calcium into the blood. Hormones are not continuously secreted, but they're released in short bursts when it's needed. Regulation of secretion normally prevents overproduction or underproduction of hormones at any given time, and of course that helps to maintain body homeostasis. But hormone secretion has to be regulated, and it is, by 3 different types of stimulus. So signals from the nervous system, chemical changes in the blood, or other hormones. Nervous impulses from the adrenal medulla regulate the release of epinephrine. Okay? So, nerve impulses to the adrenal medulla. So the sympathetic nervous system can release epinephrine. Some of those nerve fibers stimulate the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine. Okay, so we get that epinephrine then into the blood and we have a much longer response. Blood calcium levels regulate the secretion of parathyroid hormone, or calcitonin from the thyroid gland. That's known as humoral stimulus. So if the nervous system is causing the release, it's a nervous stimulus. If it's changing levels of calcium or sugar or something in the blood, that is a humoral stimulus. But also other hormones can cause the release of hormones from glands. For instance, thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. The anterior pituitary can release adrenocorticotropic hormone, and then that's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Most hormones are regulated by negative feedback. Now think back when you learned about negative feedback in Anatomy 1, and you probably heard the example of the thermostat in your house controlling the temperature, right? So the temperature is the set point, and when the temperature gets away from that set point, the air conditioner comes on and cools your house back down until it reaches back to that set point and the air conditioner kicks off, right? That's negative feedback. There was a set point, a stimulus, a stimulus caused the system to realize there was a change, an action occurred, the air conditioner came on to get back to the set point, then the air conditioner turned off. Well, that's how your body does as well. So negative feedback of blood sugar, of calcium, of many different things in the body are going to cause that negative feedback. So let's see what we've got here. Oh, we're using blood sugar. All right, so there's a stimulus that disrupts homeostasis because we had a decrease in blood sugar. That information was sent to the brain. Okay, so the brain then is going to cause the hypothalamus to secrete hormones called corticotropin releasing hormone and decrease the level of cortisol that's going to be secreted from the adrenals. So the control center, of course, is going to start an action. Let me back up. When our blood sugar levels drop, okay, the hypothalamus is going to release a controlling hormone, a releasing hormone that's going to target the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is then going to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. That is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids are going to cause an increase in blood sugar by breaking down non-carbohydrates. Now, once blood sugar gets back to normal, homeostasis has been restored. That negative feedback shuts down until the next time. So the negative feedback loop there keeps things in balance. There's a stimulus that says something got away from normal, then an action occurs to get it back to normal, then the action stops. Again, if we use the example of insulin, when your blood sugar level goes up, your pancreas releases insulin. Insulin causes your body tissues to take sugar in, so that takes it out of your blood. So blood sugar levels drop. Once blood sugar levels drop, your pancreas is no longer being stimulated to release insulin. Negative feedback. It works as long as things are normal. We do have a few hormones, however, that are regulated by positive feedback. So positive feedback, for example, like with childbirth, the hormone oxytocin stimulates contraction of the uterus, and then uterine contraction stimulates even more release of oxytocin. So the stimulus is uterine contraction, right? So stretch on the cervix of the uterus. That's going to stimulate the hypothalamus the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then binds the smooth muscle of the uterus, which causes muscle contraction, and that big fat baby's being pushed down more onto the cervix, which causes more stretch. That stretch impulse then causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes more contraction, which causes more stretch, which causes more oxytocin. Yeah, you get the picture. All right, so there are very few hormones that are regulated by positive feedback, and of course oxytocin is the one that I will ask you to know. And then just to remind you, the regulation of hormone secretion under those three controlling factors, the neural stimulus, such as we mentioned with the autonomic nervous system, releasing epi and norepi, that's going to stimulate the adrenal glands to release epi and norepi into circulation. So remember, your nervous system has that fast action, quick release, but hormones get into the bloodstream and stay there much longer. This is why, for instance, if you, let's say we are walking through the woods and we see that hypothetical bear, right, and you have that initial adrenaline rush. How quickly, though, does that go away? You have that flush of hot, right? Your heartbeat is racing and you're breathing really fast and your whole body feels like it's on fire. But that goes away really quickly. That's because that was the autonomic nervous system releasing that neurotransmitter. But some of those autonomic, or some of those sympathetic nerve fibers of the autonomic nervous system, go directly to that adrenal medulla and cause it to release epi and norepi into the bloodstream. That gives us that additional epi and norepi, increased heart rate, increased respirations. That's all going to get more oxygen out to skeletal muscles so we can make more ATP and more glucose out to those tissues, so we do have that prolonged response. The humoral stimulus, again, changing levels of something in the blood. For instance, blood sugar levels rising and falling, and the pancreas secreting insulin or glucagon to restore blood sugar levels back to normal. And then hormonal, you'll learn the hypothalamus releases many different releasing or inhibiting hormones that target other glands, such as thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary, which then releases thyroid stimulating hormone, which targets the thyroid gland, which then releases T3 and T4. T3 and T4 then travel out to body target cells and cause an increase in metabolism.